The Nile River is the lifeblood of nations. For thousands of years, it has been more than just a ribbon of water winding through the desert. It has been the giver of life, the foundation of civilizations, and the reason entire empires rose and fell. For Egypt, the Nile is not just a river, it is existence itself. Without it, the desert would swallow the country whole. But upstream, in the highlands of Ethiopia, a new force is reshaping the destiny of this ancient river, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Massive, concrete, and unyielding, it stands as Africa's largest hydroelectric project, and as a potential trigger for one of the most dangerous conflicts of the 21st century. The seeds of this crisis were planted long before the first block of concrete was poured. For decades, Egypt enjoyed near-total control over the Nile's waters, backed by colonial-era treaties that heavily favored Cairo. Ethiopia, despite being the source of most of the Nile's flow through the Blue Nile, had little say in how the river was shared. But in 2011, Ethiopia began construction of the JERD, a $4 billion mega dam that promised to transform its economy, electrify its towns and cities, and assert its sovereignty over its own resources. For Ethiopians, the dam is a symbol of national pride, a project funded largely without foreign loans, built by their own hands, and hailed as the key to a brighter future. For Egypt, however, the JERD is seen as a threat to survival. Cairo fears that the filling of the dam's vast reservoir could dramatically reduce the Nile's downstream flow, devastating agriculture, crippling its economy, and endangering the lives of over 100 million people who depend on the river. Egypt's leaders have been blunt. The Nile is a red line, and any threat to its waters could lead to conflict. If there is a shortage of water in Egypt, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi warned, there will be instability that no one can imagine. In a region already plagued by instability, those words carry weight. As the dam neared completion, negotiations became a battlefield of their own. Multiple rounds of talks, mediated by the African Union and other international actors, have ended in deadlock. Ethiopia insists it has the sovereign right to develop its resources without external interference. Egypt demands binding guarantees on how quickly the dam's reservoir is filled and how water will be released during droughts. Sudan, caught in the middle geographically and politically, plays a complex role, supporting Ethiopia's need for power but also fearing the risks of sudden water surges or shortages. Behind the diplomatic language lies a growing military shadow. Egypt has conducted joint military exercises with Sudan, with operations named Guardians of the Nile. A signal that it is preparing for all scenarios. Fighter jets, transport planes, and rapid deployment drills have been showcased for the cameras and for Addis Abeba's attention. Ethiopia, for its part, is no stranger to armed conflict, with its military hardened by years of war against internal insurgencies and border disputes with Eritrea. While both nations publicly deny wanting war, each continues to position itself in a way that makes a future clash increasingly plausible. The strategic geography of the Nile complicates any potential military action. The dam sits deep inside Ethiopian territory, surrounded by mountainous terrain and defended by sophisticated anti-air systems. A direct strike would require precision, long-range capability, and the willingness to ignite a regional war that could draw in multiple African and Middle Eastern powers. Even a limited conflict could have catastrophic consequences. Damaging the dam could unleash flooding, while cutting off its operations could destabilize Ethiopia's fragile power grid and economy. The stakes extend far beyond the borders of Egypt and Ethiopia. The Nile's flow crosses multiple nations, and any disruption could ripple across Africa's northeast, from South Sudan to the Mediterranean coast. Global powers are watching closely, not only because of the humanitarian risks, but also because control of water resources is becoming one of the defining security challenges of our time. Climate change, population growth, and industrial demand are pushing rivers, lakes, and aquifers to their limits, and the Nile may be the first major test of how far nations are willing to go to secure their share. For now, the river still flows, carrying its waters from the Ethiopian highlands to the Egyptian delta. But beneath the surface, the current of mistrust grows stronger. Each year, the dam's turbines spin a little faster, Ethiopia's power plants hum a little louder, and Egypt's concerns deepen. What began as an engineering project has become a geopolitical fault line. If diplomacy fails, the Nile could transform from a giver of life into a spark of destruction, proving that in the modern era, wars may no longer be fought only over land or oil, but over water itself. Long before the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam rose from the banks of the Blue Nile, the seeds of this dispute were embedded in history. The Nile has always been a contested prize, but the way its waters were divided was shaped not by the nations that depend on it today, but by colonial powers who carved Africa's rivers and lands into lines that served their own empires. In 1929, under British colonial rule, a treaty was signed that gave Egypt veto power over any upstream projects that might affect its water supply. Ethiopia, which was never colonized in the same way, was not a signatory to that agreement. Later, in 1959, Egypt and Sudan signed a bilateral agreement that allocated the Nile's flow almost entirely between them, again, without Ethiopia's participation. For Ethiopia, these agreements have always been relics of an unjust past, legal chains it never accepted. When Ethiopia announced the JERD in 2011, it was not simply an infrastructure project. It was a declaration of independence from what it saw as decades of Egyptian dominance over the river. The timing was symbolic. Egypt was consumed by political turmoil after the Arab Spring, its government distracted and divided. Ethiopia seized the moment, laying the foundation stone for the dam and rallying its people behind the vision of a self-reliant, electrified future. The project became a point of national pride, funded largely by Ethiopians themselves, with citizens buying bonds to support construction. Billboards across Addis Ababa carried slogans proclaiming the dam, our future. In Cairo, the reaction was swift and alarmed. Egyptian leaders, military planners, and diplomats understood the stakes immediately. The Nile supplies over 90% of Egypt's freshwater. Its agriculture, its cities, and its very survival are tied to that flow. The idea of an upstream power controlling that tap was unthinkable. Early leaked reports suggested that Egypt had even considered military options, including airstrikes or special forces operations to sabotage the project before it could be completed. Publicly, officials called for negotiation, but behind closed doors, contingency plans were drawn up. Sudan's position added a layer of complexity. Historically aligned with Egypt on Nile matters, Sudan found the dam potentially beneficial for its own agriculture and electricity needs. The JERD could help regulate the river's seasonal floods and provide cheap power, but Khartoum also feared what might happen if the dam failed, whether from engineering flaws, sabotage, or war. A catastrophic breach could unleash a wall of water racing toward Sudan's cities and farms, killing thousands. This left Sudan in a balancing act, sometimes siding with Cairo, sometimes with Addis Ababa, and often simply calling for more talks. The dispute also drew in outside powers. The United States, under different administrations, tried to mediate, often favoring Egypt due to long-standing strategic and military ties. Ethiopia, wary of U.S. influence, sometimes turned to China, which has invested heavily in African infrastructure and sees the JERD as part of its broader Belt and Road ambitions. The Gulf states, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, have courted both Egypt and Ethiopia, offering investments and aid, but also quietly positioning themselves to gain influence over the outcome. Even Israel, with its own experience managing scarce water resources, has been rumored to watch the dispute closely, mindful of how instability in the Nile basin could spill over into the wider region. At the heart of the dispute lies a simple but explosive question: who owns the Nile? International water law is murky, built on a patchwork of treaties, customary practices, and vague principles like equitable and reasonable use. Ethiopia argues that it has every right to harness the river for development, just as Egypt did decades ago when it built the Aswan High Dam. Egypt counters that its dependence on the Nile is absolute, and any threat to that flow is an existential danger. Both positions have merit, and both are rooted in national survival. As the years passed and the dam neared completion, talks became increasingly tense. Ethiopia began filling the reservoir in stages without a final agreement in place. Egypt denounced the move as unilateral and dangerous. Ethiopia insisted it was merely exercising its rights. Each filling season became a moment of heightened anxiety in Cairo, with satellite images showing the growing blue expanse of water behind the dam's walls. Egyptian media warned of droughts, crop failures, and economic collapse. Ethiopian state TV celebrated each milestone as a triumph of sovereignty. This is no longer just a water dispute. It has become a struggle over identity, sovereignty, and power in Africa's northeast. The dam has transformed the Nile from a shared lifeline into a strategic weapon, one that could be used intentionally or not to pressure or punish downstream nations. In the shadow of that dam, the possibility of a miscalculation, a provocation, or a desperate act grows more dangerous each year. And while diplomats speak of cooperation, generals quietly prepare for the day those talks fail. The waters of the Nile may still flow freely for now, but both Cairo and Addis Ababa are preparing for the day when diplomacy is no longer enough. Military planners on both sides have been quietly studying scenarios, running exercises, and testing the limits of their capabilities. For Egypt, any strike on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam would be one of the most complex military operations in its modern history. The dam sits over 500 kilometers from Egyptian territory, deep in the Ethiopian highlands, surrounded by rugged mountains and defended by Ethiopia's air defense systems. A successful operation would require long-range strike aircraft, mid-air refueling, and pinpoint precision to damage the dam without causing a catastrophic flood, a near-impossible balance between force and restraint. The Egyptian Air Force's F-16 Fighting Falcons and Rafale multi-role fighters are capable of reaching Ethiopian airspace with the right support, but the risk of detection and interception is high. Ethiopian forces have been modernizing, adding surface-to-air missile systems and radar coverage to protect critical infrastructure. Intelligence gathering would be essential. That's why analysts believe Egypt would not act alone. Any strike would likely involve coordination with Sudan, using Sudanese territory as a staging point. Joint exercises between the two nations, tellingly named Guardians of the Nile, have already showcased rapid deployment drills, river crossing operations, and large-scale troop movements. Officially, they are defensive. Unofficially, they are a rehearsal. Ethiopia, however, is not an easy target. Decades of internal conflict have hardened its military leadership, and its terrain gives it a natural defensive advantage. Beyond physical protection, Ethiopia has another form of deterrence, the potential to use the dam itself as leverage. By controlling the flow of the Blue Nile, Ethiopia could impact Egypt's water supply without firing a single shot. In a prolonged crisis, simply holding back more water than usual, even under the guise of technical necessity, could apply immense pressure on Cairo. This is what makes the Djerd such a powerful bargaining chip, and also why Egypt views it as such a dangerous threat. Covert operations remain another possibility. Some experts suggest that Egypt could sabotage the dam through cyberattacks, targeting its control systems to cause malfunctions or shutdowns without triggering a flood. Ethiopia is aware of this risk and has reportedly hardened its cyber defenses, but no system is completely secure. There is also the prospect of destabilizing Ethiopia indirectly, supporting internal opposition movements, or exploiting ethnic and regional tensions to distract Addis Ababa from the dam issue. While such actions would be deniable, they could also backfire, plunging the region into deeper chaos. The danger is not just in what each side is willing to do, but in how easily a chain reaction could spiral out of control. A border skirmish between Sudan and Ethiopia, already a possibility given their disputes in the Al-Fashaqar region, could draw Egypt into a wider confrontation. An airspace violation, an intercepted aircraft, or even a mistaken military drill could ignite a conflict neither side truly wants. Once blood is spilled, political pressure at home could push leaders into escalation, even if the initial clash was unintended. International mediation remains the primary safety valve, but it is weakening. The African Union, despite multiple rounds of talks, has struggled to produce a binding agreement. The United States and the European Union have offered to step in, but their involvement is viewed with suspicion by one side or the other. Meanwhile, outside powers with their own interests, China, the Gulf states, and even Russia, are offering investments, military deals, and political backing in ways that could tilt the balance. If the Nile crisis becomes entangled in the global competition between East and West, it could turn from a regional dispute into a proxy battlefield. The stakes are immense. If a military strike were to damage the dam significantly, the consequences could be catastrophic. A sudden release of billions of cubic meters of water could sweep through Sudanese towns, destroying infrastructure, farmland, and lives before the floodwaters even reached Egypt. On the other hand, if Ethiopia continues to fill the reservoir aggressively during dry years, Egypt's agricultural heartland, the Nile Delta, could wither, threatening food security for millions. Both outcomes would be disasters on a scale difficult to imagine. This is why some analysts now describe the Nile dispute as a mutual hostage situation. Ethiopia holds Egypt's water future in its hands. While Egypt holds the ability to physically destroy the project, Ethiopia considers its greatest national achievement. Neither side can act without risking devastating consequences for itself as well as its rival. In such a tense balance, miscalculation is the enemy, and mistrust is the fuel that keeps the fire smoldering. For now, the war over the Nile remains in the shadows, fought in negotiation rooms, military drills, and media broadcasts rather than on open battlefields. But the longer the stalemate continues, the more each side feels compelled to prepare for the moment when words fail and action becomes inevitable. The dam stands firm on the Blue Nile, its turbines spinning, its reservoir slowly rising. And somewhere in the minds of generals in Cairo and Addis Ababa, the question is not if the battle for the Nile will erupt, but when. It begins not with an explosion, but with silence, a sudden drop in the Nile's flow at the Sudanese border. The water level monitors in Cairo show an unexplainable decrease, far more severe than seasonal changes. Egypt's Ministry of Water Resources sends urgent cables to Addis Ababa. The official reply is slow, vague, claiming temporary technical adjustments at the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. But in military command centers, the assumption is immediate. Ethiopia is holding back more water than agreed, and Egypt's red line has been crossed. Within hours, Egypt's National Defense Council meets behind closed doors. Satellite imagery confirms the suspicion the reservoir behind the Jerd is swelling rapidly, filling faster than previous years. The intelligence brief includes another troubling detail. Ethiopian air defenses have been redeployed closer to the dam, and military units are on heightened alert. The conclusion is inescapable: something has changed, and not in Egypt's favor. Day one of a Nile war might open with cyberstrikes, not missiles. Egyptian cyber units, possibly working with allied states, could target Ethiopia's power grid and dam control systems, seeking to disable operations without triggering a catastrophic flood. Simultaneously, disinformation campaigns erupt online, spreading conflicting stories about water shortages, power outages, and unrest in Ethiopian cities. The goal is to destabilize without crossing the visible threshold into war, but in a crisis this tense, subtle moves can backfire. If Ethiopia detects interference, it may respond directly. Ethiopian fighter jets patrol closer to the dam, and radar systems are set to trigger readiness. A misread blip on a screen could prompt a defensive launch. A single intercepted aircraft, even if only on reconnaissance, could bring the crisis into the open. At this point, diplomacy becomes a race against the clock. The African Union, the United States, and Gulf mediators scramble to open backchannels, but every hour increases the risk of irreversible escalation. Should the cyberfront fail to resolve the crisis, Egypt's military could shift to kinetic options. From Sudanese airfields, Egyptian Rafale jets streak south under the cover of night, hugging the terrain to evade radar. Their target is not to destroy the dam entirely that would unleash devastation down river, but to disable its turbines and spillways, crippling its function while leaving the structure intact. Yet even a limited strike is anything but safe. Precision munitions can miss. Defensive fire can hit attackers, forcing them to respond. Once blood is spilled, restraint becomes an illusion. Ethiopia's response could be swift and brutal. Military strikes on Egyptian or Sudanese positions, closure of airspace, and, most dangerously, a deliberate slowdown of the Nile's flow. With every cubic meter of water withheld, the pressure on Egypt's farmlands and cities grows. In just weeks, crops in the Nile Delta begin to fail, food prices soar, and public anger mounts. The Egyptian leadership faces a grim choice: escalate further or accept a weakened bargaining position. This is how wars over resources spiral, not in a single decisive battle, but in a chain of moves and countermoves where each side believes it is acting defensively. The Nile becomes not just a river, but a weapon wielded in real time, and with Sudan caught in the middle, the risk of collateral devastation is immense. Towns along the Nile in Sudan could face either flooding from dam damage or drought from withheld flows, turning its people into unwilling victims of a war they never chose. The international fallout would be immediate. Global grain markets would reel from Egypt's agricultural collapse, refugee flows could destabilize neighboring states, and the perception that water wars have arrived would send shockwaves through every region with contested rivers, from the Tigris to the Mekong. Major powers might be forced to take sides, not out of moral principle, but to protect their own economic and strategic interests. The Nile Basin could become the epicenter of a new kind of global conflict, where the fight is not for territory, but for survival. In the final analysis, the battle for the Nile is a warning to the world. As climate change tightens its grip, and as populations grow, water will become the most precious resource of all, and the most dangerous to fight over. The Nile's waters have sustained life for millennia, but in the coming years, they could just as easily take it. The question is whether Egypt and Ethiopia will find a way to share their lifeline, or whether history will remember them as the first nations to turn one of Earth's great rivers into a battlefield. The dam still stands, the river still flows, but the current of mistrust runs faster than ever. And if the day comes when the silence on the Nile is broken by the roar of jets and the thunder of explosions, it will not just be Africa that feels the shock. It will be the entire world.